Between 1347 and 1353, a plague so devastating swept across Europe that it killed nearly half the population. Up to 200 million people worldwide died in just 6 years. The Black Death was humanity's darkest hour, reshaping society, economics, and the entire course of history. But what if those disease-carrying fleas had never made the journey from Asia? What if the Black Death never happened? The world would be shockingly different from the one we know today. The Black Death, also called the bubonic plague, arrived in Europe in 1347 on trading ships from the east. Within days of infection, victims developed painful black swellings, high fevers, and usually died. It spread like wildfire through medieval cities where people lived in cramped, unsanitary conditions with no understanding of germs or disease transmission. By 1353, Europe had lost between 30 to 60% of its population. Entire villages were wiped out. Cities became ghost towns. The social, economic, and psychological impact was staggering. But this catastrophe, as terrible as it was, fundamentally changed Europe in ways that eventually led to the modern world. So what if it never happened? Let's explore this alternate timeline. In our timeline, the Black Death destroyed the feudal system. Before the plague, Europe was overcrowded. Peasants were abundant and cheap. Lords had all the power. After the plague, with half the workers dead, suddenly labor was valuable. Peasants could demand higher wages, better treatment, and more freedom. This shift eventually led to the end of serfdom and the rise of a middle class. In the alternate timeline, without the plague, none of this happens. Europe remains overcrowded. The population continues growing throughout the 14th and 15th centuries. With abundant cheap labor, lords have no incentive to improve conditions or pay better wages. Feudalism persists much longer, perhaps into the 1700s or even 1800s. The rigid medieval class system remains locked in place. If you're born a peasant, you die a peasant. Social mobility is nearly impossible. The concept of a middle class develops very slowly or not at all. Here's something counterintuitive. The Black Death, despite being a catastrophe, actually accelerated economic progress. With fewer people and higher wages, there was incentive to develop labor-saving technologies. Water mills, windmills, and better farming equipment became more widespread. Innovation increased because labor was expensive. In the timeline without the plague, there's no such incentive. With cheap labor everywhere, why invest in expensive new technology? Why build a complex machine when you can just hire more workers for pennies? Agricultural productivity remains low. Farming methods stay medieval, simple wooden plows, no crop rotation, inefficient techniques. This means most people must work in agriculture just to produce enough food. There's no surplus population to work in cities, develop crafts, or pursue innovation. Europe remains poorer, more agricultural, and less technologically advanced well into what should be the Renaissance period. The Renaissance, that explosion of art, science, and culture in the 1400s and 1500s, was partly made possible by the Black Death. The plague killed so many clergy and scholars that new ideas could flourish. Wealth concentrated in fewer hands, creating rich patrons who could sponsor artists. Social mobility allowed talented individuals to rise. Without the plague, the Catholic Church maintains its iron grip on intellectual life. Universities remain conservative institutions teaching ancient doctrines without question. Challenging religious authority is dangerous and rare. The artistic renaissance might still happen, but much later and weaker. There are fewer wealthy patrons. Society is more rigid and conservative. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci or Michelangelo might never get the opportunities to create their masterpieces. Scientific advancement crawls forward at a snail's pace. The scientific revolution of the 1600s might not happen until the 1800s. Figures like Galileo, Newton, and Copernicus either don't emerge or their ideas are suppressed more effectively by a stronger, more established church. In our timeline, Europe's population in 1300 was about 75 million. The plague reduced it to perhaps 50 million. It didn't return to pre-plague levels until around 1600. In the alternate timeline, the population keeps growing. By 1400, Europe might have 100 million people. By 1500, perhaps 150 million. by 1600, possibly 200 million or more. This creates enormous problems. Medieval agriculture can't support these numbers. Famines become more frequent and severe. Millions starve. Forests are completely cleared for farmland, causing environmental damage. Cities become impossibly overcrowded, disease-ridden slums. The age of exploration, when Europeans sailed to the Americas, Asia, and around Africa, was partly driven by changes the Black Death caused. Labor shortages made spices and luxury goods from Asia incredibly valuable. Social mobility meant ambitious men of modest birth could become ship captains and explorers. Without these changes, European exploration happens later or differently. Columbus's voyage might not occur until the 1550s or 1600s. The Americas remain unknown to Europeans for another century or more. This gives Native American civilizations more time to develop. The Aztecs and Incas might advance technologically. They might even develop resistance to Old World diseases before Europeans arrive, potentially changing the outcome of colonization entirely. When Europeans finally do arrive, they face more advanced, more populous native societies. Colonization is harder, slower, and more contested. Perhaps the Americas never become dominated by European culture the way they did in our timeline. Fast forward to 2025 in this alternate timeline. Europe is massively overpopulated, perhaps 2 billion people crammed into a continent that in our world has about 750 million. Most live in poverty. Feudal-style social structures persisted into the 20th century. The Industrial Revolution, which required certain social and economic conditions, happens much later, perhaps in the 1900s instead of the 1700s. This means modern technology arrives a century late. We're living in a world that technologically resembles our 1920s or 1930s. Democracy spreads more slowly without the social changes the plague triggered. Many countries might still have monarchies or authoritarian governments. Human rights and individual freedom are less developed concepts. Global population is probably higher, but living standards are lower. Without the technological progress that followed historical events, humanity remains poorer and less advanced. The Black Death was unquestionably one of history's greatest tragedies. The suffering was unimaginable, but paradoxically, it also broke down the rigid medieval system that was holding Europe back. It created conditions for social mobility, economic innovation, and eventually the modern world. Without it, Europe and the world would have remained locked in medieval stagnation far longer. Sometimes, terrible events can have unintended consequences that eventually lead to progress. The Black Death reminds us that history is complex, and even catastrophes can reshape the world in unexpected ways.